my 30th percentile. Okay, moving on to quartiles. With quartiles, basically what we've got is we've still got this whole, we've got the 100%, but we're going to divide it this time into 4 parts. So we've got this middle, which is our second quartile. Halfway between that is our first quartile. Halfway between the second quartile and the end is the third quartile. So when we look at this, we've got, this is also called the median. So when you are looking on your calculator at one variable stats, you're not going to see this second quartile. You're only going to see median, but those are one and the same. So the one variable stats menu will give you your quartile values. And so looking at that, you can get these from that. And it divides it into 25% segments. So we've got 25% in each one of these to divide that up. Okay, so the first quartile is the same as the 25th percentile, and it divides the bottom 25% and from the top 75. And you can kind of see that here. You've got the 25 and the 75. The second quartile is the same as the median. It separates the bottom 50% from the top 50%. And the third quartile is the same as the 75th percentile, and it separates the bottom 75% from the top 25%. Okay, so looking at one reason we want to find our quartiles and our percentiles is to be able to find these different ranges, which can help us determine outliers and so forth. The main one that we're going to work with is the interquartile range, which is referred to as the IQR. With that, you have to subtract the third quartile minus the first quartile. If you want to get your semi-interquartile range, then you do the interquartile range divided by 2. The mid-quartile range, you add the third and first quartiles and divide by 2. And then here with your 10-90 quartile range, you're going to subtract those percentiles. So again, we're not really going to use these bottom 3, but the top one we will use for identifying some outliers. Okay, the 5-number summary is also important, and it's important because you'll use this in graphing your box plots and so forth. So with the 5-number summary, there are 5 numbers that you have to use in doing the 5-number summary. The first one is the minimum value. The second is your first quartile value. The third is the second quartile value, which is the same as your median. The third value is the fourth value is the third quartile, and then the fifth value is your maximum. So you need to be able to identify your 5-number summary values. Okay, so if we want to look at this data set here and find the 5-number summary, so we just said our 5-number summary is the minimum, the first quartile, the median, the third quartile, and the maximum. Okay, so these again need to be in order. So we can pretty clearly see the minimum is going to be 0.8. The maximum is 77.8. Okay, the median we know is the middle 2 values because this is a data set of 50. So we need to find the average of our middle 2 values. So we've got 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So here's our middle 2 values. So if we average those two together, 13.7 and 14.1, then we're going to end up with 13.9 for our median. Okay, so our median is here in the middle. The first quartile is the same thing as the 25th percentile. You could go through the process that we just did for finding the 25th percentile, or another way to look at that is to actually look and find the middle half of the lower half. Okay, so if I've got half of my data is divided here, then if I find the middle data value of this bottom half of my data, that's going to represent the first quartile. So looking at the bottom half of the data, that's 25 values. So if I go to the middle of the 25 values, that's going to be my 13th value. So that's going to be this 7.9 because that's my 13th value. Okay, to find the third quartile, I'm going to do the same thing. I've got 25 values that are larger than the median here. So here's my median. So I want to find the 13th value there. So that's 5, 10, 11, 12, 13. So this is going to be the middle value on this. So that's going to be 21.5. So these are my 5 number summary, the 5 numbers that are part of the 5 number summary that I need. Okay, you should be able to graph what's called a box and whiskers graph or a box plot. And it's a graph that basically consists of a line extending from the minimum value to the maximum value. And on that line, we have lines drawn at each of the quartiles, the first quartile, the median, and the third quartile. Okay, so if we look at this example here, I like to personally scale this a little bit so that it comes out looking pretty nice. If we look at doing this, our values go up to 77.8. So I'm going to just do this by tens. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. We don't really need to scale the vertical axis here. There's no real reason for doing that. So I'm going to go and I'm going to put a vertical line at 0.8. So I'm just going to have to kind of estimate that. Put a vertical line at 7.9. Put one at 13.9. Put one at 21.5. And then finally over here at 77.8. Okay, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to connect the first quartile and the third quartile together and form a box, hence the name box plot. And then I'm going to draw a straight line out and connect the minimum and the maximum. So what this tells me is that our data is kind of heavily skewed to the left, and or we've got more data to the left, so it's actually skewed to the right because this is where our tail of the graph would be. So in looking at that, we have a tail that's kind of tailing off to the right, so it would be right skewed if we were to look at the graph. But we can see the concentration of our data here more to the left. And you can see a little bit better diagram here of that. If you don't scale it, you lose kind of the value of the box plot because you're not able to see that it's concentrated on the left side. And we just talked about the skewedness of the graph. Okay, so in order to do what's called a modified box plot, you actually have to identify what your outliers are. And this is where that interquartile range comes in, or your IQR. So we want to be able to figure out what the IQR is for this. Once you have your IQR, you're going to multiply it by 1.5 and then either add that to the third quartile or subtract it from the first quartile, and anything outside of that will become an outlier. So if we look at our values here, we found that our third quartile was 21.5 and our first quartile was 7.9. So if I subtract those two, I get 13.6. So what I want to do from that is my first quartile, like I said, was 7.9, and my third quartile was 21.5, and my IQR is 13.6. So I want to take that 13.6 and multiply 1.5 times the IQR. So I'll have 1.5 times 13.6, and that's going to give me 20.4. Okay, this value is important because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the third quartile and add that 20.4 to it. So I'm going to have 21.5 plus 20.4, and that's going to give me 41.9. Anything larger than 41.9 in our data set is going to be considered an outlier. I'm going to go and look on the bottom side by doing the first quartile minus that same 20.4. So that's going to be 7.9 minus 20.4, and that's going to give me negative 12.5. So anything lower than negative 12.5 is going to be considered an outlier. So we want to look at our data set and see see if we have any that's larger than 41.9 or smaller than negative 12.5. So when we look at this, 0.8 is our smallest value, so we don't have any outliers on the lower side, but we had calculated that to be 41.9. So we have excuse me, 4 values that are larger than 41.9. So all 4 of these would be considered outliers based on the formula for calculating an outlier. So when we go to construct a modified box plot, basically we're going to put some kind of asterisk to identify where those outliers are, calculator and StatCrunch. Okay, so here I am on the calculator. So the first thing you would want to do is to go to Stat, Edit, and make sure that you have your data values entered. I've already taken the time to enter those. If you want to pause and enter the data values from the data set that we've been using, then that will be fine. From here, you want to go to Stat and Y equals, which brings up your stat plot. We want to choose the first one. On this one, you want to make sure that on is highlighted. And then I think for a lot of us, we had it last on the histogram. So you want to come down where it says type and go all the way over to, for now, we're going to choose the 5th graph and press enter to make sure your calculator has accepted that. Make sure your X list is correct. And then instead of pressing graph, which is our tendency to do, we want to always do zoom and number 9 for zoom stat. And here is that same box plot that we just got through doing. If you press trace and use your arrow keys, then you can go back and forth, and it'll actually down here at the bottom show you that our minimum value is 0.8. Our first quartile 7.9, our second quartile, which is our median, is 13.9, third quartile is 21.5, and then our maximum is 77.8. If I go back to my stat plot and choose the 4th graph, the 4th graph is actually the modified box plot. So I'm going to do zoom 9 again. And this time you can see those 4 that we identified through our calculations that we said were outliers. You can see those. If you use the arrow key, actually do trace and then the arrow key, you can go over and it'll take you to each outlier and tell you what the values are that correspond with those outliers. So that is how you do the box plot and the modified box plot on your calculator.